Good evening. Welcome to the 56th program at CIC. Today's program promises to be an interesting conversation between two experts on similarities between India, Israel, and West Asia. It's a discussion weaving together insights on extensive economic, military, and strategic relationship between the countries, the bilateral diplomatic relations in the area of defense, agriculture, technology, and water management that both countries share, India and Israel. You'd be surprised. I was surprised when I found out that India is the largest buyer of Israeli military equipment, and Israel is the second largest supplier for the Indian defense equipment after Russia. It's about a $9 billion military trade, and even the trade relations between the two countries go back to almost 1,000 years. Prime Minister Modi was the first prime minister to visit Israel, and that has started and put into fast gear the relationship between the two countries, which stands on three foundations. There's the economic, defense, as well as the technology. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our special guests today, Professor Asher Susa and Mr. Parthasarathy. We are truly honored to have you here with us today. Thank you. And before handing over the stage, it gives me great pleasure to share their profiles with you. Mr. Parthasarathy is presently the Chancellor of the Central University, Jammu, President of the India Habitat Center, New Delhi, and Director in the India-Sri Lanka Foundation. Also a member of the Executive Committee of the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi, member of the Government of India's Task Force to review national security structures in India. He is also a columnist writing for a number of newspapers, magazines, and academic journals in India and abroad on foreign policy and national security issues. A career Foreign Service officer, retired from service in 2000. He has served as Ambassador of India to Myanmar and High Commissioner of India to AU, Pakistan, and Cyprus. Professor Asher Susa is a Professor Emeritus of the Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. He was the Director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University for 12 years and taught for over 35 years in Tel Aviv University's Department of Middle Eastern History. He has been a Fulbright Fellow, a visiting professor at Cornell, University of Chicago, Brandeis University, and Stein Family Professor of Modern Israel Studies at the University of Arizona. His recent book on the emergence of the modern Middle East, and recently he has also written on Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, the two-state imperative. He's also a specialist on Jordan. He's earlier, just a few minutes back, we were discussing some of the similarities and the people we knew in Jordan. And I'd like to introduce both of you, sir. Thank you very much for your presence.
Professor Susa, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome a distinguished professor from the Tel Aviv University here to speak to us about the relationship that we have not only bilaterally. We've heard about the weapons purchases. I'm told that some of that was very useful in Balakot. But the thing is that this is it is a unique relationship. They have just been through a raucous election, and we'll have an equally raucous one, I assure you. But we are both linked together by being democracies. And that matters in a world where the democracy is under pressure in more ways than one. So that really is the basis. And I'd just like to keep this brief because what we're planning is to have professors speak for about 15 minutes. Then we'll have an exchange of views, and then we'll throw it open to all of you. So we want to have adequate time for that. My own interesting thing, which is not little known, is not very well known, is that how this relationship was sort of midwifed, as it were, through the United States. I recall when I was in Washington, we had Congressman Stephen Solars, a great friend of India, who really pushed very hard. And Professor Sosa, revealing no secret to say that that it was done also by the B'nai B'rith Society in New York, where we had come to the conclusion that with the European initiative, things were moving for peace with Israel. Israel and its neighbors, and the time had come to recognize. So when the meeting was to take place with B'nai B'rith, which was organized by Congressman Solars, the one question the B'nai B'rith asked is, when are you going to have a nice, good relationship with Israel? And Prime Minister Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, his reply, Professor, was very soon. But I have to go to elections. It will be after the elections. This was in 1988. He lost the elections, but came back. The Congress Party, nevertheless, did what was his unfulfilled request. So I thought, just for the record, I should place this here. But Professor Souza, we're willing to listen to you. I want to say that all this happened at a time so that it will help you take off. Just 1 decade earlier, after the Yom Kippur War, and this is how the world changes, Saudi Arabia imposed sanctions on us because there was the oil crunch, and they said that they would resume oil supplies and end sanctions only if we closed the Israeli consulate in Mumbai. Well, Mrs. Gandhi flatly refused. And that was a part of history I was happy to live through. But now we're into very much more interesting times because there are new thoughts. I mean, for the first time, the father of Israel, the Israeli state, David Ben-Gurion, has been seconded in elections by the present Prime Minister, heading for his 6th term, I think, if I was right. And we have been, in recent years, Professor, rather less forgiving of succeeding governments. The last term or two, no really long-term governments here. So, but I won't say any more. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for being with us. We hope to listen to you and what you have to say on India, Israel, and perhaps this place which you in the West call as the Middle East. And my answer to the Western powers is, who the hell are you to designate them the Middle East? Middle between who and who? To us, they're our neighbors in West Asia. So we welcome you as a distinguished representative of West Asia.
Well, thank you, Chancellor, for your very kind remarks. Indeed, a lot has changed in the last few decades in our region and in the relationship between Israel and India, and it's about those changes that I would like to speak. And what it is that the changes in the region mean for Israel and its place in the region, and also some issues that arise as a result of these changes that also have to do with India-Israel relations. Interestingly, the story the Chancellor told of Saudi Arabia trying to force India to close the Israeli consulate in Mumbai, I flew here by Air India over Saudi Arabia. That could not have been done before. And the reason we do so is because the Saudis now allow Air India to fly over Saudi Arabia to Tel Aviv. No planes could fly over Saudi Arabia to Tel Aviv. That is an indication of the change. India-Israel relations, but also the changing place of Saudi Arabia in the region and the changing place of Israel. I will add a comment, a historical comment. I mean, after all, my business is the history of the region, about the term Middle East. I have been saying in my talks here, and I've given 6 or 7 of them in the last few days, that the term Middle East is antiquated, colonial, and analytically useless. And it's a term that we shouldn't be using anymore. You guys have had it right. It's West Asia. I mean, nobody, for us, if you sit in Tel Aviv or in Istanbul or in Cairo, we are not the middle or the east of anything. The Middle East is only the Middle East if you're looking at it from London. Then it is the Middle East on the way to the Far East. And this is a colonial term that has been used since 1902 in order to describe that part of the world which was the passage to India. It's all about the colonies. And that we still use the term is, I think, a bit out of date, to put it mildly. And I would say, also in terms of Israel's place in the region should be subdivided into 4 parts that make much more, I would say, are much more coherent. North Africa, which the Arabs call the Maghreb, the western part. The Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, Turkey. And it is that part of what was called the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, that Israel really is a functioning part of. And Israel has peace with Egypt. It has very close relations with Greece and Cyprus, who, like Israel, are the non-Arab, non-Muslim players of the Eastern Mediterranean. And Israel has a very close relationship with them. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis visit these places all the time, including Bulgaria. The ski instructors in Bulgaria all speak Hebrew because of all the Israelis who go to Bulgaria to learn to ski. They are obviously not going to go to Syria or to Iraq to learn to ski. And we have much more in common with the Eastern Mediterranean than we will have with countries like Syria or Iraq for any time in the foreseeable future. Then you have the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. Those are the 4, I would say, regions that do make more coherent sense when talking about this region. What are the key changes that have taken place? And I will say what I think has happened in the Arab countries, how this impacts upon Israel and Israel's place in the region. The rise of Iran and what it means for Israel. The question of Palestine. What should Israel do about it? And hopefully I'll get that all into 15 or 20 minutes. Could I have my... Don't go over the mark. By the way, you people are great fans of cricket. The fact that Netanyahu has been prime minister for longer than Ben-Gurion reminds me of a batsman who bats for 2 days and scores 1 run, and another batsman who bats for an hour and scores a century. So the time element here is not critical in judging these people's place in the history of our nation. So you may understand where I come from, having said that, but I have no reason to disguise who I am and what I stand for. So the region has changed dramatically in the last 25 years or so. And this has to do primarily with the systematic, continuous decline of the Arab states. Today, the 3 most important players in the region, the movers and shakers of the region, are Iran, Turkey, and Israel, none of which is an Arab state. The Arab states are all in different levels of crisis mode. And those who were the movers and shakers of the Middle East in the 1950s and the 1960s are countries that are struggling to keep their head above water. Take Egypt, for example. Egypt, led by the great, perhaps the greatest Arab of the 20th century, Gamal Abdel Nasser. In Gamal Abdel Nasser's time, he was up there on the international stage together with the greats of the non-aligned movement, including Nero, Tito of Yugoslavia, and Abdel Nasser. Who is the Abdel Nasser of the Arab world today? I don't think you'll find one. Egypt is no longer the great influential country it once was. Have a look at what has just happened in Syria. A long civil war in Syria, which is now being sorted out by Russia, Turkey, and Iran. The Arabs aren't even invited to the table. They're not even there at the discussion. In 1958, when Syria was about to fall apart, Abdel Nasser collected Syria into what he called the United Arab Republic and united Syria with Egypt. Egypt was the savior of Syria in 1958. Now nobody even asks Sisi what he thinks about Syria. He may have an opinion, but it doesn't matter to anybody. This has come about, and I don't have the time to go into it too much, but I will refer you to a series of studies that have been conducted over the last 20 years or so by the UN, and they're called the Arab Human Development Reports. And these come out more or less annually in thick 300-page volumes. You don't have to read it all, just read the executive summary, which is 12 to 15 pages, very enlightening. These are rather pessimistic reports on the Arab countries, their economy, their society, their achievements. Important to emphasize, written by Arab scholars for the UN. These are not UN studies conducted by Europeans or Americans who may have some anti-Arab or anti-Islamic bias. These are studies conducted by Arab sociologists, economists, and experts. And they raise 3 points. 3 deficits, they call them. The deficit of political freedom, the deficit in first world education systems, and the deficit in gender equality. These combine to form economies that are poor performers. The lack of political freedom and the lack of first world education systems cuts back on the capacity to have creativity, initiative, innovation, those components of the globalized economy today. And the Arab countries are not performing well at all in those spheres because of these deficits. If we add to that the lack of gender equality, the lack of gender equality is perhaps the worst of all. If women are marginalized from the education system, and women are marginalized by tradition from the labor force, it's not permissible for traditional reasons for women to work outside the home, you have very low female participation in the labor force, which means that more or less half the population doesn't work. So these are poorly performing economies, partly because of that and for the other 2 reasons. Women who have lower levels of education tend to have larger families. The better education women have, the fewer children they tend to have. That's not a Middle Eastern phenomenon, that is a universal phenomenon. But in our region, in West Asia, you have this phenomenon of poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations. Well, you don't have to be an economist to understand that poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations are heading for a disaster. This is not a prediction about a disaster which is about to happen. We're in the disaster now. This is the disaster. And the Arab Spring was not this outburst of democracy, but the outburst of anguish of an entire generation who have no future. What we call the waithood generation. Those youngsters from the ages of 18 to 30, who after childhood and then boyhood come to waithood, when they reach the age of 18 to 30, and they wait. Wait for a decent education, which is not coming. Wait for a job, which isn't coming either. So what is there to hope for, other than desperately trying to emigrate to somewhere else? The region cannot sustain its population. There were 280 million Arabs in the year 2000. There are 420 million now. 100 million have been added just in the last 10 years. And in the 2020s, it'll be 460 million. Who's going to provide for these people? Who's going to provide jobs, money, water? In 2025, if things continue as they are, Egypt is going to face a water crisis. So this is what I call the crisis of the Arabs. And as the Arabs are in crisis mode, the non-Arab states of the region become the great powers. Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And here I come to the, let's say, the geostrategic background to the problem that Iran poses to Israel. Iran is a great regional power. It now has a reach, the likes of which it has never had in the modern era. As a result of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, the overthrow of Saddam, the overthrow of the Ba'ath, as I've said in various places in my visit here, the overthrow of Saddam and the overthrow of the Ba'ath may have been morally good things. The overthrow of an evil regime, an oppressive regime, a cruel regime. An Iraqi exile wrote a book about Saddam's Iraq, which he called The Republic of Fear, a regime based on fear. So maybe it was a good thing that Saddam was removed in that respect. But the removal of Saddam and the removal of the Ba'ath is the disempowerment of the Sunni Muslims of Iraq. And it is the empowerment of the Shiite Muslims of Iraq. That is history. That is a change in the regional balance of power between Sunni and Shia, the likes of which I cannot place since the advent of Islam in the 7th century. It was always the Sunnis who ruled Iraq, whether it was under the Ottomans or even under the British. And the Shiis were the downtrodden underclass. Well, the Shiis are not the downtrodden underclass in Iraq. They are now the masters of Iraq. And if the Shiis are the masters of Iraq, Iraq becomes the automatic playing field of Shiite Iran next door. If Saddam's Iraq, as bad as it may have been, Saddam's Iraq was the gatekeeper that kept Iran out of the Arab East. The removal of Saddam and the removal of Sunni-controlled Iraq opened Iraq to Shiite expansionism from Tehran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, where Hezbollah is the most powerful political force, a Shiite militia. The Iranians presently sit on the Mediterranean. Unheard of in the modern era. Iran is now a neighbor of Israel because the Iranians are present in Syria and in Lebanon through their various proxies, and in Syria presently after the civil war, not only as with proxies, but with the Iranians themselves. And Israel sees this as a great threat. The presence of Iran so close by, the fear that somewhere down the road Iran will develop a nuclear capability, and that this will have a very damaging effect on Israel. So now, there are those who will say, well, you know what, do you really think the Iranians will take an atomic weapon and drop it on Tel Aviv? I mean, they're not that crazy. And then what may happen to Iran if they do such a thing? Even what Israel could do to Iran in retaliation, never mind what others might do. It doesn't make sense for Israel to fear that kind of thing. I would agree. Very unlikely that the Iranians would do that. Maybe a 1% chance. But I assure you, there is no prime minister in Israel, not Netanyahu, no Ben-Gurion, no anyone else, who would allow this 1.1% chance to exist. Nobody knows if the 1% chance will happen or not. Even though it's 99%, probably not. And if you look at Israel's past, there's a sensitivity to people who threaten to wipe the Jews off the face of the earth. So Israel has a reason to be anxious, but I would say not specifically because of the danger that the Iranians will drop a bomb on Tel Aviv, but for another reason, more subtle and I would say more serious from Israel's point of view. If Iran does go nuclear, and its proxies like Hezbollah, who have 170,000 rockets and missiles trained on Israel, and Hamas attack Israel with these rockets and cause serious damage in Israel, which is quite possible, especially now with these rockets being upgraded with GPS, which makes everything more precise. Will Israel be able to retaliate against Hezbollah the way it would like to retaliate in order to put an end to this, knowing that Iran has a nuclear umbrella for Hezbollah? What kind of constraints will that impose on Israel's security establishment to make the kinds of decisions that it would have made in other circumstances? That is what I think really disturbs the people in Israel when they think about the long term. That is a much more realistic scenario than the Iranians dropping a bomb on Tel Aviv. It's not that simple. It's a more, I would say, nuanced kind of argument. I'll just make one more comment about the Palestinians and I will end my remarks there. Because the Arab world is so weak and in such disarray, and there are refugee issues today, even from within the Arab world. The Arab world has just over 5% of the world's population, but 37% of the world's refugees are in the Arab countries as a result of civil wars and domestic conflicts that have cost the Arabs in the last 10 years $600 billion of eternal loss. No one will replace that. Who will rebuild Syria? With what money? Who has that kind of money? So there are some in Israel who say, well, why should we bother about the Palestinians? Nobody else seems to bother. There is the deal of the century coming from President Trump. I don't think there are too many people in the Middle East, I must say, who think that this is going to be the deal of the century, that this is really going to offer a great breakthrough. The Arabs are already up in arms against it, even before the details have been published, but what has been published has been enough to turn the Arabs against it. So the Israelis will say, let the Palestinians reject the Trump initiative and leave it there. The Palestinians don't want to follow, we're doing what we can, and leave it. I would argue that that would be a horrific mistake for Israel to make. We must address the Palestinian question, not because the Arabs care, and not because the international community may care, even if the international community couldn't care less. And the Arabs don't care any more about the Palestinians, they care much more about Iran. We should care for our own reasons, not to do the Palestinians a favor, but to continue to preserve Israel in accordance with its ideological raison d'etre. Why was Israel created in the first place? Israel was created in the first place to be the nation state of the Jewish people. We always aspired from the beginning to be a democratic, legitimate member of the family of nations. We cannot be either if we continue the occupation of millions of Palestinians. We cannot maintain our Jewishness, riding roughshod over millions of Palestinians. We cannot maintain our democracy doing so. And therefore, by continuing the status quo, we are undermining Israel's international legitimacy, and I would argue its long-term survivability. So it is for our own sake that we should see to it that something is done about this, not necessarily through an initiative from outside. I would say an initiative that comes from Israel. And an initiative that comes from Israel, even a unilateral initiative. Because I don't think we are yet at a point where the Israelis and the Palestinians can negotiate an agreement. We've been trying to do that for 25 years and haven't got anywhere. I don't think we'll get anywhere anytime soon, and I could explain why not. I wrote a whole book about it. I won't go into it now. But I don't think there will be an agreement. And I say, therefore, for Israel's own reasons, to gradually roll back the occupation over 3, 5, 7, 10 years through an Israeli initiative in order to create what I call a two-state reality. I don't say a two-state solution. I'm not sure it's going to solve everything. But a two-state reality, where there is a Palestinian state more or less next door to Israel, living more or less in some kind of modus vivendi. That's probably the best we could hope for. Certainly better than leaving things just as they are. Thank you.
Really invigorating to hear, especially what would please this audience here, the absolute candor with which you spoke of a solution in which the Palestinians can live with dignity. How that is worked out will have to be for you, for the Palestinians and others to resolve. I think India is too much tied up with its own regional issues, and we would very much like to see this is resolved, because if it is not, what worries us is the emergence of radical Islam, that Islamic people are being denied their rights, and that has an impact on us regionally and domestically. Now, to come to a larger question is definitions. Some people called it the Persian Gulf, others called it the Arab Gulf. We being what we are, just call it the Gulf, because we have no intentions to get involved with either the Arabs or the Iranians in their disputes, or the Shias and Sunnis in their disputes. And I thank you for bringing that to our notice. But my larger question is as follows. The concern you have about Iran's nuclear programs have come from you with a very clear answer, point made, that the Persian civilization will cease to exist if Iran even thinks of moving in that direction. And you know that the Iranians are very pragmatic people. They are a civilization which is ancient, but perhaps radicalized at the moment. So my question to you is, these rivalries you spoke of, Shia, Sunni, Arab, Persian, within the Arab world, for power, is Israel going to stand firm, as we are doing now and the present Netanyahu government is doing, leaving no space for the Palestinians to themselves move on a process, if not a solution? Do you think you see that changing? Because I think peace there, I told you, radicalization. And the other thing I want to tell you is that radicalization worries us, because 6 million Indians live in the Gulf Cooperation countries, the Arab countries. We get roughly 70% of our oil supplies from these Arab Gulf countries. With sanctions placed on Iran by the US, yes, we will try and see what the Chinese and others do. We perhaps have some bilateral, but it's going to be very problematic. Couldn't you think of a larger way to look at the Persian-Iranian thing? Because it's ultimately they're Persian. It's an old civilization. So your answer perhaps to that would be very interesting for us to listen to, because you've said, yes, two-state solution is a problem, but anything which allows the Palestinians to live with dignity, which you have espoused, do you see it coming about? If so, how?
Well, thank you for those very important questions. First of all, radical Islam and Palestine. And I will also talk about, the two-state issue in that respect, and then I'll say something about Iran. Radical Islam is historically, politically, a much larger issue than Palestine. Radical Islam did not emerge only because of Palestine. One of the great thinkers who is an inspiration to Islamists in the whole world, and certainly in the Arab world, was a great Muslim thinker from India, Abu al-Maududi, who didn't write what he wrote in the 1930s because of Palestine. Maududi wrote what he wrote because of what he called the Jahili state. A Jahili state, Jahiliyyah, as I suppose many people here all may know, of course. The Jahiliyyah is the pre-Islamic period. That period of ignorance and barbarism before the advent of Islam, with the last of the prophets, Muhammad the Prophet. And Maududi's argument was, and this has been the argument made by Islamic radicals throughout the region for decades, a just Muslim society is a society based on the Sharia. A society which is not based on the Sharia is not a just society. That is a very serious argument, which results from 200 years of interaction between the Muslim world and the invading West, starting most aggressively with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, and is not about Palestine. To link the whole issue of Islamic radicalism and Islamic reform, which has been going on for 150 years, to Palestine, I think is not exactly to the reality as they really are. Now, I grant you, the Palestine issue doesn't make things any better. And it certainly does provide avenues for radical Muslims to hold the opinions they hold. I doubt very much whether a resolution of the Palestinian question tomorrow morning would resolve the issue of Islamic militancy, which has to do with the nature of Muslim society. Is it Shari or isn't it? If you look at the charter of the Muslim Brethren, the cardinal principle is Tatbiq al-Sharia. Tatbiq al-Sharia means the implementation of the Sharia, not Palestine, not the liberation of Palestine. So it's an issue that it relates to the Muslim society, it relates to Muslim identity. It's a much bigger issue than Palestine. And I think it's too easy to say, if the Israelis would only stop settling the West Bank, militant Islam would recede. I doubt it. The rise of an organization like ISIS, for example, has almost nothing to do with Palestine. Your neighbor, Pakistan, hardly about Palestine, I would think. And the complaints that you have on your borders with the Muslim neighbors are about your problems, not ours. So it's too much to put on the shoulders of Palestine. Although I agree, this is an issue that Israel has to attend to. It won't solve the problem of Muslim radicalism. It will solve a lot of Israel's problems. And that's why I say Israel should do it, for its own sake, not for other people's sake, for its own sake. Iran and the nuclear issue. I agree that Iran is not going to rush into a nuclear war with Israel and pave the way for the devastation of Iran, even if it devastates Israel at the same time. But what I said was that is not the main issue that the Israelis are preoccupied with when it comes to Iran. It's something far more subtle than that. I think the Iranians are determined to obtain nuclear weapons. Now, why? And here there is, I would say, room for a discussion. Why do the Iranians do what they do? And there are at least two possibilities to explain. One is the standard explanation that the Israeli government and I think the present US administration share. Iran is inherently aggressive, expansionist, domineering, has a hegemonic design in the region, and in the process seeks to destroy Israel. A fair analysis, I can't refute it. It's probably in many ways correct. But there's an alternative explanation, which may be as valid. That this is not an aggressive, hegemonic design, but a defensive posture. Iran is a paranoid state. Didn't begin with the Ayatollahs. If you look at the history of Iran in the last 150 years or so, Iran was a country beset by foreign intervention to the degree of a loss of its actual independence. Never formal loss, it was never colonized. But if you look at Iran on the eve of the First World War, Iran was divided into three sections. There was the northern section, which was the sphere of Russian influence. There was the central sliver, which was autonomous Iranian. And the southern part of Iran was British influence, the British coming up from India. There was intervention in Iran. The Shah was overthrown in 1941, and the last Shah, who was overthrown in 1979, was put in place by the Allies in the middle of the Second World War. It is very well known. You know, very often people say the CIA did this and the CIA did that, which is usually untrue. But in the early 1950s, the CIA really did intervene in Iranian politics with the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh. The CIA, MI6, they were really involved in this. That has good historical foundation. So the Iranians have, and now with the rise of the Ayatollahs, the fear that the US essentially seeks to undo this regime, to overthrow the regime. Now with the sanctions, even some American officials have even said that, which I think only reinforces this Iranian paranoia, and not to any good cause. So maybe this is defensive, similar to the manner in which people explained the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Soviets sat in Prague. Why did they sit in Prague? Because they wanted to spread communism and dominate the world and have a hegemonic design? Or were they sitting in Prague because they just had 20 million Russians killed by the Germans and they didn't want that to happen again? So it was all about self-defense. So there are two ways of explaining these things. So I would say I fully understand the Israeli fear and anxiety. The Iranians look at North Korea and they look at Iraq. They say North Korea is nuclear, the US doesn't attack. Iraq did not have nuclear weapons, and the Americans attacked. Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program and ended up on the trash heap of history. The consequence, the conclusion, we should have it too. Not necessarily out of some aggressive design, but to defend ourselves like North Korea does. So the portion lacking, I would say, from Israeli policy, we wield the big stick. And we make sure that the Iranians don't establish themselves in Syria, and I think we're doing exactly the right thing. We cannot afford to have them sitting there. But we don't use diplomacy. Along with the big stick, there should also be a diplomatic channel. We should also try and talk to them, not just wield the big stick. And here maybe an idea that somebody suggested to me yesterday at a similar kind of discussion in Pune. Maybe India could be the go-between. India has good relations with Israel. India has good relations with Iran. India and Israel have never been on the same page on Iran. Ever since the establishment of diplomatic relations, they've never been on the same page on Iran. But neither Israel nor India have ever allowed the Iranian issue to upset our bilateral relationship. So maybe it is an idea that one should pursue. Maybe India is a country that could play the role of trying to ameliorate the tensions between Israel and Iran as a good friend of both of these. Because I do think that Israel should add an element of diplomacy to the wielding of the big stick in order to check out the possibility that it is the paranoia and not the aggression. And if it is, maybe there's a basis to talk about life in a more sensible, rational way, rather than this kind of hostility which is leading along in the longer run to some kind of unforeseen clash.
Thank you for saying this, but I was discussing it with some friends yesterday. You know, when the Iranian Revolution took place, the CIA could not be able to destroy all its papers. The Iranians meticulously put those papers together and distributed it in 35 volumes of American embassy papers captured by the Iranians. And I was unfortunately given the task of reading that for presenting it to the Prime Minister. It did leave me with a malady, which is my specs, because it was very difficult to read. But going through those papers of what the Americans were doing, ranging from Afghanistan to Paris, made it clear that they were out for regime change, that the overthrow of the Shah was found to be unacceptable. So I'm coming back to what you have said, Professor. Rather than India, we don't like to punch above our weight. Don't you think that's something which Israel and should persuade the United States? We'll join you in that, to be doing. Talk to the Iranians. They're neither 10 foot tall nor totally evil. I mean, the funny part of it is when I visit Iran and go to our embassy, in the Islamic Republic, there is never a shortage of wine to serve in an embassy. So, that's a pretty yielding experience, especially if you see the Iranian middle class. So my point is, why not, you carry immense influence rather than India trying to influence the Iranians, which we shall do. But don't you think the United States should be persuaded that a policy of, yes, by all means, act tough, but also a policy of engagement is worthwhile?
Well, that corresponds pretty much with what I'm saying. I hesitate to suggest, what the United States should or shouldn't do.
So everybody does. Anyway.
But I can speak more easily about what I think Israel should do, and I did say so. I think that the possibility of pursuing a diplomatic option is something we should also think about because of our past. In the early 1970s, there was an Egyptian diplomatic initiative to come to some kind of settlement with Israel. And the Israeli government of the time didn't think it was genuine and didn't take it very seriously. Then came the Yom Kippur War of 1973, in which 2,600 of our sons were killed, and many thousands more were maimed and injured and suffered for life. And then we made peace with Egypt. Wouldn't have been so much nicer had we made the peace before the war. So it is exactly that which I think of here. When Obama spoke to the Iranians and Obama negotiated the agreement with the Iranians, not all of Israel was against Obama. Netanyahu was, and even went to Congress to make a speech against him. not an act that all Israelis thought was the right thing to do. But when the agreement was signed, the security establishment in Israel was positive about it, different to the opinion of Netanyahu. And in the security establishment, there were those who were saying, and you could get this, from the retired generals and other retired security people, who voiced their opinions, which were very similar, one could imagine, with those in active service. That if Israel would have launched a military strike against Iran, even if the military strike was absolutely successful, which is not always the case, Israel could have achieved a break in the Iranian program, which would have lasted for a year, 2, 3, until they would have rebuilt what had been destroyed. Here the agreement offers 10 to 15 years, which was achieved without firing a shot. So it depends what you do with the 10, 15 years in arranging the future relationship with Iran.
Well, on the positive side, I think if you go through civilizational history of the Semitic people, then the Jewish people and the Persians have always been good friends. This, would you agree, is a historical aberration? Because historically, there was a good Jewish population in Persia, as there had been even in Turkey. Would you therefore, purely in civilizational terms, not agree that it would be better to, by all means, contain whatever, but also engage?
No, as I say, I agree with you. But here, in terms of the history of the Jews and the Iranians, or the Persians, there are different phases in this history. Basically, I agree with you, positive. The problem with the present regime in Iran is that Israel was a very good friend of the Shah. And the Iranian regime of today has an account against Israel.
I think that's for internal reasons more than
external. It may be for internal reasons, and from the receiving end of Iranian rhetoric against Israel, even if it is just for internal reasons, Israelis find it very, very difficult. If the Iranians say, death to Israel, and we will destroy Israel, Israelis cannot just dismiss this as hot air. They also say death to America. But America is a big place. If we had the territory between the Pacific and the Atlantic, and neighbors like Mexico and Canada, we'd also treat it with relative dismissal.
This reminds me of the saying of a very famous person in one of our neighboring countries who goes by the name of Hafiz Muhammad Said. And on his website, he put that the greatest threat to Islam comes from the Hindu, Jewish, and Christian civilizations. And our aim is to plant the green flag of Islam in Washington, New Delhi, and Tel Aviv. Now, frankly, I treated that as a pipe dream. Because, and therefore, I'm sure there has to be a certain measure of understanding, as I say, so even with our difficult neighbors, with China or Pakistan, yes, we should stand firm on essentials, but keep doors open. But I come to another thing, which are two issues which will interest people here. One is oil. We've been hearing a large number of reports of oil in the Mediterranean, oil in Israel. When is Israel going to live up to that potential and become a net oil producer, exporter? We would welcome it, because as long as the price of oil falls, we are very, very happy. And right now, therefore, if any one of a major oil supplier is cut off, if you cut off Iran, the Arabs and Russians will raise the prices. And the former National Security Advisor is here, and he would assure you that no government likes price rises in this country. It's bad for elections. This was the first question I had. So perhaps, how do you see the energy situation developing in this region? It is the energy center, and hopefully Venezuela will soon also be able to join. But it's how do you look at that?
Well,
Because the Saudis are now willing to pour in huge investments for our petrochemical industries, and we are one of the largest exporters of finished petroleum products in the world, somewhere around $50 billion. So.
well, oil is not exactly what we have discovered in the Mediterranean. It's gas.
Shale gas.
And that is a huge game changer as far as Israel is concerned, both in terms of our own energy needs and for export. Part of the strategic relationship between Israel and the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean is based on gas. We all share different fields of gas in the region. And there is an effort, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, I think the Egyptians are also connected with this, in creating pipelines that will market gas from the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe. And this binds the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean together with common interests that have to do with energy. So it's not oil, but and I don't think we will have, and we don't have much impact on the oil market. But on gas, I think we will have, and we do have, a certain influence, and this is a great boost for Israel. We always used to joke in Israel that somehow, even though we were the Holy Land and God is on our side, He gave all the oil to the Arabs. And ancient Israel in the Bible is called Canaan. And the story is, Moses, who led Israel out of Egypt, he had a speech impediment, and he used to stutter. So when Moses was on Mount Sinai talking to the people of Israel, and he was saying that I'm going to lead you to and they understood Canaan, he meant Canada.
Well, the last question before we move further away. You've come to a state, which is my home state, and I'm proud of it, that is going to run out of water. One, upper riparian states have not been generous in their supply of water to lower riparians. That is an interstate problem within India, as it is with neighbors that we have. We have specific worries on the Chinese grabbing all the Brahmaputra waters, but that's we'll address. You have done some pioneering work in seawater desalination.
Yes.
And I think India, one area I would urge, perhaps, and there we will get further question I want to, is we should collaborate together on this, because you guys have the technology, you've worked on it, because I think Peninsular India, more than anybody else, is going to need this.
Oh, absolutely.
And is it being looked at?
Well, I know that one of the spheres of cooperation between Israel and India is water. I'm not sure whether it does include desalination. I would imagine that it does. I know that drip irrigation is widely used here, it comes from Israel. Water purification is widely used here, it comes from Israel. And I would imagine that desalination would be just the same. However, desalination, the process is much cheaper than it used to be, but it still is relatively expensive. So it is an outlay of quite a bit of money that has to come. The other thing is there's certain ecological influences from desalination that we're beginning to learn. I don't think you would have the same problem here because of the size of the oceans that you have at your disposal. But if you look at the Gulf, because the Gulf countries are so rich, the Arab Gulf countries, they have desalination plants all along the Gulf. As a result, the Gulf is being turned into a salt lake, because the salty water is being pumped back into the Gulf to the extent that further years down the road, it's doubtful whether they will be able to desalinate this water, and they're going to have to think of some other solution, or desalinate water somewhere else and pipe it to where they want it. Right. So there are also other issues that have to be looked at, but I agree with you. I couldn't imagine that in the water discussions that Israel does have with India, that desalination is not part of the deal. I would imagine that it would be. I mean, we've done other things in terms of water, and I know that Israel is acutely aware of problems of water management in India. There are dozens of Israeli scholars all over India who are engaged in agricultural projects that have to do with water purification and agricultural science, etc., etc. So I'm sure that desalination is high on the agenda. I can't see why not.
But as I said, we have perhaps one advantage over the Gulf. Ours is not a tiny Gulf.
Exactly.
It's the Indian Ocean.
Sure.
So there's no shortage of supply in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
Now, let's get to questions and answers if it's with you, okay with you, Professor? Please. Yes, sir. Please identify yourself, your name, and go ahead. Anga Kotsturpa. Has anyone got a loudspeaker or speaker? All right, you can speak. You can speak with them. Yeah, you can ask them.
You've spoken about possible sanctions of getting oil from Iran by the United States, right?
That?
You spoke about possible sanctions
Yes.
for countries which import oil from Iran.
They exist already, yeah.
Yeah, that's one. So under such a condition and the kind of relationship that you've discovered that Israel has, the kind of paranoia they have on Iran, how do you see India-Israel relationships in this background? Simply because India depends a lot on Iran for their oil imports and the kind of investments they've done on Chabahar. There is also a question, or rather a fear, that if India doesn't import oil from Iran because of sanctions and whatever it is, there is a possibility that China might step into Chabahar. It could queer the pitch. So how do you see this relationship between India, Israel, under such a possible scenario?
Now, you have to bear in mind the key factor here is not Israel, but the United States. It's not Israel that's imposing the sanctions. It's the United States that's imposing the sanctions. This government of Israel, I'm sure, supports the imposing of the sanctions, generally speaking. But I don't think that this Israeli government, considering its relations with India, generally speaking, and with the leadership of India as is at present, and as I understand will probably remain the same after the elections, that Israel will have any reason to see India suffer. On the contrary, I don't think Israel has ever raised the issue of the port of Chabahar. And if it is India that will seek other ways and means of obtaining oil, even from Iran or from elsewhere, in order to compensate for the oil from Iran, or obtaining oil from the Arab states, from Saudi Arabia, for example, not at a jacked up price that the Saudis may do as a result of the crisis, that Israel would have every reason to support that. Israel has no reason to see Iran suffering from the sanctions that are imposed on Iran. But it's, people talk about Israeli influence. It reminds me, we have a population of 9 million. So there is this story of, this Israeli and this Indian, saying, we're a big wig in the international community. The two of us together have a population of 1.4 billion. Of course, that's true, but our influence is not that great. Israel has much less influence than people seem to think. I wish we did have the kind of influence that suggests that Israel has. So I wouldn't, overstate what it is that Israel can or cannot do about it. But what I do think is that Israel has absolutely no interest to see India suffering for the sanctions on Iran. And if alternatives are to be found for Iranian oil, I don't think the Israelis would be those who would stand in the way.
Thank you. But one little point is that the some of our refineries from the days of the Shah have been designed for light Iranian crude, but that's a matter of detail, but that does exist. Petroleum, yeah.
Yeah, Professor, I'd like to ask three questions. One is, if you were made the Prime Minister of Israel for 6 months, how would you solve the Palestinian problem, the Gaza problem, number one?
If I was the Prime Minister?
Yes, number one. Number two, do you see any end of the Syrian problem inside? I mean, it just seems to go on and on. Is there any sight? And lastly, what I want to ask you, do you think that Iran could go the way of Egypt? Nobody thought that Egypt with Nasser would come to this stage. So do you think that with all this regimentation, lack of opportunities for women, Iran would eventually go the Egyptian way?
Thank you very much for those questions. Sometimes I do wish I was the Prime Minister of Israel.
From today.
There are things that I would do that this Prime Minister is not going to do. And I would do some of the things that I suggested now. Launch an initiative on Palestine, an Israeli initiative. Not encourage an international initiative, to launch an Israeli initiative. To gradually roll back the occupation through our own decisions. Israel has withdrawn from territory in the last 20 years twice. Not any one of these occasions was through an agreement. We withdrew from Lebanon unilaterally. If we would have waited for an agreement between Israel and Hezbollah to negotiate the withdrawal, we would still be negotiating. Same with Gaza. And I think that the only way we will get out of the West Bank is by an Israeli initiative that would have to be implemented over a long period of time. I don't think that we can walk out of the West Bank the same way we did of Gaza. We walked out of Gaza one fine day, and the results are not that great. The rockets followed and not a peace initiative. The Gazans had an opportunity to establish Singapore or a rocket base against Israel. And they decided on the second alternative. That has consequences. Dire consequences for us, and even more dire for them. So I would, as I say, launch an Israeli initiative to roll back the occupation. And I'm happy to say, I'm not alone in this view in Israel. I'm not the only person in Israel. I don't belong to some marginal minority. We are not the majority of people who think like I think. But we're not an insignificant minority either. The most important institute for strategic studies in Israel, the INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies, headed by a former chief of Israeli intelligence, former senior commander in the Israeli Air Force, one of the pilots as a younger man who bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor, as one of the things in his biography. That institute talks of this kind of initiative. They have a plan. You can go to their website and read it. A very detailed plan of how Israel unilaterally rolls back the occupation. Passing legislation also in Israel called evacuation compensation. And that is, you evacuate settlers from places where Israel doesn't want them to be, and you compensate them. You offer them compensation to go and live somewhere else, and you pay them compensation in order to encourage them to accept it, in order to reduce the friction that will evolve from that, because many of the settlers are, hard ideological, messianic religious people who won't accept this with ease. But that is what I would do on Palestine. And then on the issue of Iran, what we've been saying before, continue to wield the big stick, but together with diplomacy. There must be a diplomatic channel to see if there are other alternatives, to check out the possibility. Let's say the diplomatic channel fails. It doesn't work, doesn't yield anything. The Iranians send us packing. Okay, we haven't lost anything. We just are still where we are. But give it a try. It may yield some kind of result. So that's one thing. The Syrian problem, the destruction of Syria is so severe that it's going to take a very long time for Syria to extricate itself from this trouble. I do think one thing is interesting here, and that is Assad won despite all. He appeared to be on the verge of losing. So I'd say two things about this. One is The minority that he comes from, the Alawis, who are the ruling minority in Syria, are only 12% of the population, but they run the country, fought for their lives. They knew only too well if they would have lost, there wouldn't be much left of them. So they fought to the bitter end, and very hard and very determined and very cruelly at times. But then the Russians intervened. And the Russians saved the game for Assad. And one may ask, why did the Russians do this? And I think the reasons that the Russians did what they did is an indication of the Russians coming to Syria not for a visit. They've come to stay. That reminds me of the Israeli who comes to Heathrow Airport and the immigration officer asks him, occupation? He says, no, just visiting. So the Russians are not just visiting. And there are three major reasons why the Russians are going to stay in Syria for a long time. And that has a positive and negative impact on Israel. But I think it keeps Syria a whole state. Syria is not going to fall apart. The Russians want to be a great power once again, especially as the US footprint in the region is declining. The Russians have never got over the shock of the decline of the Soviet Union. And they are a very proud nationalistic people, and they want to see Russia up there as a great power, and Putin is doing that, and I think he's very popular in Russia because of that. Secondly, and as an adjunct of the first point, the Russian bases in Syria. They have air bases, they have naval bases, they want to keep them. And therefore they will remain there in order to keep these bases, which is a projection of Russian power in the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the third point is political Islam, radical Islam. The Russians have got a radical Islamic problem of their own, the Chechens. The second language in ISIS that was spoken second to Arabic was Russian, the Chechens. The last thing the Russians want is to see Syria in the hands of these people. It's not far from Russia. So the Russians were determined to have Assad win, to make sure that these Islamists didn't beat him. And they've achieved it. And I say, they will remain there in some form or another. I think it's expensive for them to remain there. And they're not a very wealthy country these days. But they have interests, and they will remain there. And I think Syria will be stable as a result. A regime beholden to the Russians and to the Iranians as well, who have helped them. But a country that will take a very long time to recover. And therefore, if you look at Israel these days, you can say for Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict, not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict between Israel and the Arab states, the Arab-Israeli conflict is over. We haven't fought a war with an Arab state since 1973. 46 years, we haven't fought any Arab state. We went to war in Lebanon against Hezbollah, and before that against the PLO, but not against Lebanon. Syria, which is still very hostile to Israel, is out of the count for the meantime. Even when Syria was itself, they couldn't take on Israel on their own. And once Egypt and Jordan had made their peace with Israel, Syria couldn't face Israel on its own. But now, as a country that has destroyed itself, it's not in the equation for even a longer period of time. So that does give Israel a greater sense of security. Well, that is not problem-free. We used to be, I would say, even terrified of Arab power. That the Arabs would acquire a military power based on their numbers and their wealth and the alliance with the Soviet Union, that we with then 3 or 4 million people just wouldn't be able to make it. But that's not the fear we have today. The fear we have today is of Arab weakness. The weakness poses huge problems also. You've got all these non-state actors all over the place. ISIS and Hezbollah and Hamas and company. How do you defeat these people? It's a constant war. It goes on forever. And it's sapping the Israeli psyche. So I think we still have a problem there, But it's the problem of the weakness of the Arabs rather than the problem of the power of the Arabs. And Syria's weakness only contributes more generally to this overall weakness.
Thank you. May I just add an Indian perspective to this? We kept out of the Syrian conflict. We don't mess around in this in distant conflicts. But for us, our fear was that Assad, if he leaves with a political vacuum, would be replaced by a group of fundamentalists. I've visited Syria, and what was amazing was the freedom of women, the jobs they held. It is a secular country. And we always worry about radical takeovers. And frankly, that did not appear to be a game plan as to who will succeed. Yes.
I have one question.
Yeah.
It is directed to you actually, Mr. Parsati. There was a mention that India has excellent relationships with Iran separately and excellent relationship with Israel separately, both on the economic and on the political front. India's problem is essentially Pakistan. If India intervenes in solving or embarks on intervening to solve the Israel-Iran conflict, do you think there is a deal somewhere by which we can help them to solve India-Pakistan problem, or this is too complicated for anybody to intervene?
You got the national security advisor next to you. And look, let's be real. We would like to see peace in the region. Right now, the Pakistanis and the Iranians are cutting each other's throats on a Shia-Sunni basis on their borders. We don't want to get involved in something unless the parties concerned
Want us.
want us. And the parties concerned on an issue like Iran are too many. And I think, we diplomats are accused of being cautious. But I remember the saying, it's only fools who rush in where angels fear to tread. And Iran is really one such place. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I must congratulate the professor for one of the boldest statements that I've listened to from an Israeli scholar. Thank you so much, Professor, for saying that the occupation must be rolled back. But perhaps you may also ponder over the fact that perhaps you must ask yourself if Israel is really a democracy, because you mentioned democracy along with the fact that Israel is a Jewish state. Even recently, this was in the news. So how can a state which evolves or gets created only for a particular community or a race, is that not racist? And can democracy and racism coexist? One. And two, on Syria and Iran, you talked about Russians, thinking that, wanting to stay there because they don't want radicalism. But the fact remains that ISIS itself, according to a book which I recently read by Jessica Stern on ISIS, she says that the entire leadership of ISIS was created in Camp Bucca, an American detention center in Iraq, including Baghdadi. And this is a fact which is relatively unknown everywhere. So how do you explain the fact? And the fact also is that it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq before, which became ISIS. And the Western powers were supporting it against Assad. So this is a very complicated equation here. How do we address this situation when Western powers, though they didn't create ISIS, certainly, but the actions led to that. And even today, for radicalism to go away, the conditions must be conducive for it to go away. On the one hand, you have the Palestinian issue, where the Israelis are refusing to withdraw to the 1967 borders. On the other hand, we have the situation in Yemen, where again the Western powers are giving a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia. So there is enough material for the ISIS and other such groups to tell the Muslim people that this is what is happening to you across the globe. Radicalize. See, this was evident very clearly recently in Sri Lanka, because rich people were radicalized and they were part of the suicide bombing squad. So how do you address this situation?
One more question will take you together. Yeah.
Good evening, Professor. So my question is, like in the recent past, India had voted in favor of a resolution that condemned the US recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and in another instance, India had abstained from voting on a resolution that voting on an amendment that voting on an amendment that was condemned the violence caused by the Hamas. So India, there's a ambiguity whether India is supporting Palestine and or Israel. It's not taking it's a sort of a fence-sitting stance. So, do you think this affects Indian-Israel relations? And I also want to ask you, how do you foresee Indian Israeli diplomatic relations in the future?
That's
And
like two questions there.
So should I respond? I see here, and I'll do this very briefly. I didn't answer your question about Egypt and Iran. I missed it. So I just will say in one sentence that I don't think that Iran is going to go in the direction of Egypt. There are many reasons. Iran has a much better scientific infrastructure. It has basically a sound economy. If it was allowed to be itself, they have oil. It's a potentially much more wealthy country. So it has numerous basic characteristics that Egypt doesn't have, and therefore I don't see Iran ending up where Egypt is. So that's in a nutshell. Israel a Jewish state and therefore a racist state? Yeah, question. And questions have answers. So I'll answer you. For Israel to be a Jewish state means the recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. Like Greece is the nation state of the Greek people, like France is the nation state of the French people, like Sweden is the nation state of the Swedish people. We are Jewish not as the Italians are Catholics. We are Jewish as the Italians are Italians. Our Jewishness, I am not a religious person. I do not even believe in God. I'm an atheist. I don't do anything religiously Jewish. I eat all the wrong things, and I do all the wrong things with a great deal of pleasure. But I am Jewish in my nationality, in my ethnicity, in my association with my people. I identify very strongly with the Jewish past, and I identify very strongly with the future of the Jewish people. They are my people. But this is not based on religion. And the state of Israel, there is no contradiction between Israel being the nation state of the Jewish people and a democracy in which 20% of the people in Israel, like minorities all over Europe, are citizens of the state enjoying equal rights. Now, there is a problem in Israel between the Jewish majority and the Palestinian minority. Sure there are. Because the Palestinian minority is part and parcel of the Palestinian people with whom we are in conflict. That's a problem. But that doesn't make Israel a racist state. It means that Israel has a problem with its minority, as Turkey has with its Kurdish minority, with minorities all over Europe. That doesn't make all these states racist states and non-democracies. Only we are a racist state if we have these domestic problems. That is singling us out for special treatment. Now let me say something. What is prejudice? Prejudice is composed of three things. You single out, you apply a double standard, and the subject is always guilty. That's prejudice. And I'm saying, judge Israel like you judge everybody else. Don't single us out. We are just like everybody else. We should obey the law like everybody else does, and we should be criticized for not obeying the law when we don't. Because we are not the only country that doesn't obey the law every now and then. I taught in America for a few years at the University of Arizona. University of Arizona, as I'm sure you all realize, is on the border with Mexico. So it's a big issue in the university whether Trump builds a wall or doesn't build a wall. It's an issue that the people in the university, which is a predominantly liberal university, I would say that the students and the faculty there are probably not Republicans for the most part, but probably mostly vote for the Democrats. So there was a protest against the war. But they also protested against the Israeli wall in the West Bank, which, by the way, most of which is not a wall but a fence, but doesn't matter. Did we put up the wall there to prevent immigrants from coming in? We put up the wall to prevent suicide bombers from killing our people. Since the wall has been put up, or the security fence, the number of Israelis killed by suicide bombers has been reduced from a few hundred a year to 0. Well, that makes a difference. Our lives also matter. Jewish lives also matter. Now, and I said in my article that I wrote in the university paper, why do you single out the wall with Israel? There are walls in Belfast between Protestants and Catholics. They're called peace walls. Why don't you talk about them? Why don't you talk about the fence in Spanish North Africa that keeps the Africans out of Europe? They shoot them on the fence when they're trying to emigrate into Europe. Why do you talk only about Israel? Why do you single out Israel? And I would say those who single out Israel for this kind of criticism, they've got a problem, which they should address too.
For the other gentleman.
Now,
I'm just coming. Just a minute.
Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. The meaning of that, I think both of these statements by President Trump, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and the recognition of the Golan Heights as part of Israel's sovereign territory, are far less. They're symbolic gestures, far less important than people think. They don't change anything on the ground. Jerusalem has been the capital of Israel since 1948. I mean, so Trump was only recognizing something that has existed since 1948. By the way, Russia also recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But the Russians did something that Trump didn't do. The Russians recognize Israel as the capital, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and also recognize the Arab part of Jerusalem as the future capital of Palestine. Trump didn't make any kind of reservation of that nature, although he said in the declaration that the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is in no way judging the border issue. Now, many people didn't look at that, didn't notice that, and even the Israeli government liked to take the Trump declaration and misrepresent it, as if it were the recognition of all of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, therefore kicking the Palestinians out of Jerusalem, so to speak, leaving them out of the potential partition of the city in a future settlement. But Trump never said that. And the American position is not that. So it's, I'd say, much ado about nothing, really. And on the ground, it doesn't change anything at all. All that has changed on the ground is the building of the American embassy, the major building of the American embassy is not in Tel Aviv anymore, but in Jerusalem. No big deal.
Thank you. May we have the last two questions? Mr. Narayanan and the last one.
The ISIS issue.
Yeah, we can combine that.
Okay.
We're running out of time, Mr.
Okay.
Narayanan.
Now, would you call, who are Israelis? Are they different from Jewish? For example, in India, we have Indians.
Yes.
We don't have, Hindus or Muslims or Christians.
Yeah.
So similarly, in Israel, people who live there are Israelis.
Exactly.
Why do you say that they're Jewish?
Well, first of all, because in terms of their national identity, that is, they are Jewish. There is a history to the creation of Israel. It has a singular history of its own, which without that history, one can't really understand what the whole story is about. Why did Israel come about at all? Israel came about not because the Bible says so. Not because the Jews of Eastern Europe suddenly recognized in the late 19th century that we should do what the Bible says we should do. Excuse me?
Your ambassador said that in UN.
That what?
Okay, let's not interrupt, please. Let's not interrupt. Yes.
What my ambassador knows about the history of Israel is his business. I know what I know. And I don't necessarily agree what Israel's ambassadors say anywhere. You're asking me, I'm telling you what I think. Israel was created as a result of Jewish oppression. That nationalist movements throughout Europe would not accept Jews as part of them. Jews could not be Germans. Jews could not be Poles and could not be Russians, etc., etc., etc. So the Jews came up with the idea, if we can't be members of these nations, we will establish a nation of our own. In the only place that makes any historical sense at all, and that is in our homeland of antiquity. That's where the Bible comes in. Not as a justification for the whole idea, but as the location of where we have a historical association. We have no historical association with Chile. And we are not going to do it in Argentina, or in California for that matter. Palestine, Eretz Israel, has a historical connection to our people for thousands of years. So it made sense to do it there.
Mr.
Israelis are not only Jewish. Israel has a soccer team, just like everybody else has. The captain of the Israeli soccer team is an Arab. 5 of the 11 players of the Israeli soccer team are Arabs. So what are we supposed to do with that? The Arabs of Israel are citizens of Israel. They carry Israeli passports. It's true that because Israel defines itself as the nation state of the Jewish people, there is an automatic connection of Israeliness with Jewishness. But this is not particularly unique to Israel. Greekness is connected directly to Christian orthodoxy. They have a cross in the middle, not in the middle, in the corner of their flag, like we have the Jewish Star of David, like the Turks have the Islamic symbol. Turks are Muslims. Turkishness is linked with Islam. There are different kinds of nationhoods, just as India has a nationhood which is peculiar to India. How do all these peoples in India all be Indians? And really, is there no difference between Hindus and Muslims in India? Really? It's not what I hear whenever I come to India. Not to mention all sorts of other differences between all sorts of people. The caste system and what else. So I don't preach to you about that, and I won't. But so not all states are constructed in exactly the same fashion. Stateness and nationalism are not identical throughout the universe. There are different ways of doing it. And we are one way. There are others like us. But Israel is fashioned on the model of the European nation state. And just as the European nation states are not racists, neither are we.
Okay,
Now,
can I come to this last question now?
just one sentence.
Yeah.
Nationalists can be racists. And some racists are extreme nationalists. That doesn't make all nationalists racists.
Mr. Narayanan.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting and also very informative lecture.
Thank you.
I have actually a comment and a question. I did not want to speak, but Partha insisted. Twice he raised my name or my inmate. I want to tell you that I've had a long association with members of the Jewish community in Israel. And let me take this opportunity to thank you as the head of intelligence for the tremendous support that we got when we were under sanctions from the rest of the world in regard to all our defense equipment. I also had the distinction of being one of the 3 people who met Moshe Dayan when he came to India. So, I'm just mentioning these facts to say that I think the vast majority of people in India recognize Israel's contribution to India's success, which has now been transformed from what it was many years ago. But we have a problem where Partha and others are concerned that in regard to our diplomatic relationships, we have necessarily to balance a relationship with Israel with the vast majority of Muslim, the Arab and other communities, and particularly till very recently, as you just now said, the attitude of many Muslim nations towards Israel is undergoing a change, and things are hopefully turning to the better. But we have the overhang of Madudi, we have the Syed Qutb of Egypt and others. So our problem has been, how do we fully transform our relationship? Our defense relationship is excellent. And as I said, for nearly 30 years I've been involved in it, and I'm familiar with every twist and turn of the relationship. In terms of our public persona, I think it is all right. But I think deep down, it hasn't really been possible for us to utilize our connections to the extent that we would like, I think, a vast majority. And I think there are reasons for that, and you as a scholar would recognize that. How do we go about doing that without disturbing existing relationships that we have with a large number of countries in the, we usually say the Gulf, it's of course the whole of West Asia, and many places elsewhere. So, with your vast knowledge, is it possible for you to give us some ideas on that subject? I mean, we won't go, as Partha said, we don't wish to get involved in the Israeli Iranian dispute or the Israel's dispute with West Asian nations, etc. We have to try to avoid that kind of being an interlocutor in this dispute. But I think we have of course progressed. When Mr. Narasimha Rao as Prime Minister decided to establish, open relations with Israel, I, as the intelligence bureau, did a great deal of surveys, so what would be the reaction, etc. And we found that India was quite willing to accept that. And that even the Arab nations, while being unhappy, would not object to it violently. But I think we have gone much further than that. But still there is something missing in the relationship. And I don't think the India-Israel relationship is on par with our relationship with many other countries, which I believe it should, considering the great deal of interaction that takes place between the two nations. Thank you.
Well, I think what I would add to what is already being done, there is only one thing that I could, think of off the bat. There is a certain lack, and this is not only true of relations between Israel and India. This is true of relations between, I think, many countries and other countries, and between Israel and many other countries. Israel has had relations with certain countries that have a level of intimacy that are exceptional. Level of intimacy, I don't think exists entirely in the relationship with India yet. And that is what I think, if I may say, maybe what you were aiming at. And I think that the level of intimacy should come about by Israel and India conducting very frequent, high-level diplomatic contacts where we consult with each other openly about our respective regional issues, like your problem with Iran, like our problem with Iran. Like the gentleman asked me about the oil supplies or the use of the port of Chabahar. India and Israel should talk about these things openly. And a host of other issues. The relationship with the Arabs. The relationship between Israel and the Arabs has changed to such a degree that I think India can allow itself a much greater measure of freedom of maneuver in the relationship with Israel without having to fear that the Arab states are going to criticize India for doing so. The Arab states do it themselves. And this is true exactly of those countries that you keep on mentioning as being so important to yourselves. Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Both of these countries. Israeli sportsmen have been at events in the UAE and in Oman recently. It's like a weekly occasion. So Israelis win gold medals in athletic competitions, and you hear Hatikva, the Israeli anthem, being played in Abu Dhabi. Well, that doesn't happen every day. And it's happening. There was a time when they wouldn't allow our sportsmen to appear with the emblem. But they've stopped doing that. So I think that the world has changed so much that there is an opening for this kind of intimacy between Israel and India, which I have not exploited to the extent that we could and should in order to upgrade the relationship even further.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So please give him a hand. And thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much.
So, on behalf of the Patrons Board and Fellows of CIC, let me thank you, Professor Sassar and Mr. Partha for being here with us today and for such an insightful and interesting conversation. Thank you, Gary, for making this happen, and thank you all for being here with us today. Our next program is on May 25th. Another interesting program. It's going to be on post-elections, a discussion, a cephalological discussion. And we hope you can all join us back again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.